The Vatican hid the true age of Mary when she gave birth to Jesus, and here's why. Imagine discovering that one of humanity's most sacred stories might have been misrepresented, that crucial details were deliberately omitted, altered, or even concealed for nearly 2,000 years. Today you will learn a truth that can completely change your understanding of one of the most important events in Christian history. For centuries, the Church has presented Mary to us as a young teenager at the time of Jesus' conception. Renaissance paintings, Hollywood films, history books all portray a girl between 12 and 16 years old receiving a visit from the angel Gabriel. But what if I told you that this version might be completely wrong? What if Mary was not a teenager, but an adult woman, perhaps over 20 years old? And what if the evidence for this truth has always been before our eyes, but systematically ignored or suppressed? What you are about to discover is not a conspiracy theory. It is archaeological evidence, analysis of ancient manuscripts, studies of first-century Jewish customs, and hidden clues in the canonical Gospels themselves. Information that serious academics have been investigating for decades, but which rarely reaches the general public. Why would this information have been concealed? The reasons are more complex than you imagine, and involve not only theological issues, but also political and cultural factors that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. This is not an attempt to diminish Christian faith or to question the divinity of Jesus. On the contrary, it is a search for historical truth that can even strengthen our understanding of the magnitude of what truly happened in Nazareth 2,000 years ago. Prepare for a journey through forgotten manuscripts, surprising archaeological discoveries, and biblical analyses that will reveal a side of the Nativity story few know. You will discover how certain interpretations became dogma, how political influences shaped sacred narratives, and why Mary's true age might have been the Vatican's best-kept secret. By the end of this video, you will have a completely new perspective on one of humanity's most celebrated events. And perhaps, just perhaps, you will understand why some truths have taken so long to come to light. For almost 2,000 years, Christian tradition has presented us with a specific version of the Annunciation and the birth of Jesus. According to this traditional narrative, Mary was a young teenager, probably between 12 and 16 years old, when the angel Gabriel appeared to her to announce that she would conceive the Son of God. This image of the young virgin has become so deeply rooted in our culture that we rarely question its origin or historical veracity. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Caravaggio have portrayed Mary as a delicate teenager. Hollywood has perpetuated this vision in films like The Nativity Story and The Passion of the Christ. Even our Christmas celebrations reflect this traditional interpretation. But where exactly does this version of the story come from? The answer might surprise you. Mary's specific age is not explicitly mentioned in any of the four canonical Gospels. Neither Matthew, nor Mark, nor Luke, nor John provide this information directly. So how did this truth become so firmly established? Tradition has relied on three main pillars: interpretations of later apocryphal texts, presumed marital customs of the time, and above all, decisions made by church councils in the early centuries of Christianity. Texts like the Proto-Evangelium of James, written in the 2nd century, describe Mary being brought to the temple at 3 years old and betrothed at 12. But these texts were written long after the events they describe. This narrative of the young virgin served specific theological purposes. It emphasized Mary's purity, innocence, and total obedience to divine will. A young teenager better symbolized these concepts than an adult, experienced woman. It was an image that resonated with the faithful and reinforced certain doctrinal interpretations. But here's the problem: traditions, even the most sacred, are not necessarily historical facts. They are interpretations that crystallize over time, influenced by cultural contexts, political needs, and specific theological goals of each era. Modern academic studies have begun to question this traditionally accepted version. Anthropological, archaeological, and even linguistic analyses of the original texts are revealing a very different picture from what has been handed down to us for centuries. The truth is that Mary's age when she conceived Jesus may have been deliberately obscured or misinterpreted, and this did not happen by chance. There were very specific reasons why certain information was emphasized while others were left in the shadows. If you are enjoying these revelations, and want to follow other historical discoveries that challenge traditional narratives, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because the knowledge you're gaining here is not just entertainment, it is true historical education based on serious research. And there are many more hidden truths to explore together. Activate the bell so you don't miss any of these discoveries that can change your perspective on the history you thought you knew. Modern archaeology has been a revolutionary tool for understanding how people truly lived in biblical times. And when we apply archaeological discoveries to the marital customs of first-century Palestine, a very different picture begins to emerge. Excavations at sites like Nazareth, Capernaum, and other cities in Galilee have revealed fascinating evidence about the social structure and family customs at the time of Jesus. These discoveries suggest that first-century Jewish marital patterns were more complex than we have traditionally assumed. Analyses of family tombs, funerary inscriptions, and remnants of dwellings indicate that although engagements could be arranged early, actual marriage often occurred when women reached a more mature age. Archaeological discoveries in Jewish necropolises of the era show evidence that women who died in childbirth were, on average, older than tradition has led us to believe. Particularly interesting are the findings at Sepphoris, an important city located just 6 kilometers from Nazareth. Archaeological studies of this area reveal a more cosmopolitan Jewish society than we often imagine, with Hellenistic influences that may have impacted local customs, including marriage practices. Discoveries of marriage documents preserved in dry climates, such as those found in caves near the Dead Sea, show marriage contracts that often involved women in their 20s, not teenagers. These legal documents provide valuable insights into when marriages actually occurred in the Jewish culture of the period. Another crucial aspect revealed by archaeology is the structure of family homes at the time. Excavations show that Galilean Jewish families lived in multi-generational housing complexes, where several generations coexisted. This suggests a social structure where important decisions, such as marriages, were made by the entire family clan, not just the immediate parents. This archaeological evidence also reveals that the family economy was more complex than we have traditionally assumed. Women actively participated in commercial and productive activities, which indicates that they needed a level of maturity and experience that a teenager would hardly possess. Particularly relevant are studies on the textile trade in the Galilee region during the 1st century. Evidence suggests that women often managed family businesses related to weaving and textile trade. This would require not only technical skills, but also commercial and social knowledge that would have taken years to develop. Archaeological discoveries also show that the role of women in 1st century Palestinian Jewish society was more important and influential than many later interpretations have suggested. Inscriptions in synagogues, for example, mention women in positions of community leadership, which indicates a level of social respectability that usually came with maturity. Analyses of ossuaries, stone receptacles used to store bones after decomposition, found in Jewish family tombs of the era, often contain inscriptions identifying women by their personal achievements or social positions, not just by their family relationships. This suggests a society where women had more developed independent identities. These archaeological discoveries do not definitively prove Mary's age, but they establish a cultural context very different from what we have traditionally assumed. They paint a picture of a society where adult, mature women played crucial roles, both in the family and in the community. When we combine this archaeological evidence with the analysis of ancient texts, an interesting pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that suggests that the traditional narrative about Mary's age may have been a later simplification, not an accurate reflection of 1st century historical reality. The oldest New Testament manuscripts and apocryphal texts contain fascinating clues that are rarely discussed in popular circles. When we examine these primary sources with modern textual analysis methods, we discover surprising details about Mary that challenge our traditional understanding. The Proto-Evangelium of James, although non-canonical, is one of the oldest texts to provide details about Mary's life. Interestingly, linguistic analyses of this manuscript suggest that it may have preserved older oral traditions. While we traditionally interpret its descriptions as indicative of an adolescent Mary, a closer reading reveals important ambiguities. Coptic manuscripts discovered in Egypt contain narratives about the Holy Family that differ significantly from the versions we know. Some of these texts, preserved in isolated monasteries, suggest that Mary possessed a level of wisdom and spiritual maturity that would have been unusual in a teenager, even by the standards of the time. Particularly intriguing are the differences between the oldest versions of the canonical Gospels and later translations. Certain Greek words used to describe Mary can have multiple interpretations. The term Parthenos, traditionally translated as virgin, can also simply mean young woman or unmarried woman, without necessarily implying an adolescent age. Analysis of Syriac manuscripts, some of the oldest translations of the Gospels, present linguistic nuances that suggest alternative interpretations of Mary's status. These texts, preserved by Eastern Christian communities, sometimes use terminology that indicates maturity rather than extreme youth. Gnostic texts, although rejected by the official church, have preserved alternative traditions about Mary that deserve academic consideration. The Gospel of Mary and other manuscripts discovered at Nag Hammadi present a Mary with characteristics of leadership and spiritual wisdom that would be more consistent with an adult, experienced woman. Christian Arabic manuscripts, particularly those preserved by communities in the Middle East, contain versions of the Nativity story with unique details. Some of these texts describe Mary as possessing specific knowledge of medical and obstetric practices, skills that typically required years of experience to develop. Recent discoveries of papyri in European museums have revealed fragments of early Christian texts that had never been fully catalogued. Some of these fragments contain references to Mary's experience and wisdom that seem inconsistent with the narrative of a naive teenager. Paleographic analyses of Byzantine manuscripts show that certain words related to Mary's age and maturity were systematically altered over the centuries. These changes were not accidental. They follow patterns that suggest deliberate editing to conform to specific theological interpretations. Codices preserved in monasteries in Ethiopia and Armenia contain versions of early Christian history that have been rarely studied by Western academics. These manuscripts, isolated from later influences of the Roman Church, have preserved traditions that may be closer to the original versions. Ancient liturgical texts used in early Christian celebrations also provide important clues. Some of these documents describe Mary using language that suggests spiritual and social maturity, characteristics more associated with adult women than with adolescents. Particularly relevant are comparative studies of different manuscript families. When we compare Greek, Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and other textual traditions, interesting patterns emerge about how Mary's narrative was transmitted and in some cases modified. Now I want to know, what is your personal experience with these discoveries? Had you ever heard of these differences between ancient manuscripts? Or is this the first time you are discovering that alternative versions of the story we all know exist? Leave your experience in the comments. It's fascinating to know how each person reacts when they discover these hidden layers of early Christian history. The reality is that ancient manuscripts paint a much more complex and nuanced picture of Mary's story than we generally learn. And when we combine this textual evidence with archaeological discoveries and knowledge of the cultural customs of the time, a very compelling alternative narrative begins to emerge. To truly understand Mary's probable age, we must delve deeply into first-century Jewish culture in Palestine. The marital customs, family structures, and social expectations of that era were dramatically different from what many modern interpretations assume. In first-century Jewish society, particularly in the Galilee region, marriages were complex events involving not only the bride and groom, but entire families and even communities. Anthropological studies of ancient Mediterranean cultures suggest that although engagements might be arranged when girls were young, actual marriage was often delayed until they reached full physical and social maturity. Rabbinic traditions preserved in the Mishnah and Talmud, although compiled centuries later, reflect practices that already existed during the Second Temple period. These texts indicate that the ideal age for female marriage was often around 20, not in early adolescence as we commonly assume. The Jewish family economy of the time depended significantly on female labor. Women were not just wives and mothers, they were active economic partners. Mary, being from a family of artisans, Joseph was a tekton, a builder or craftsman, probably actively participated in the family economy. This required skills and knowledge that took years to develop. Studies of first-century Galilean culture reveal a more cosmopolitan society than we often imagine. The proximity to important trade routes and the influence of Hellenistic cities like Sepphoris created a unique cultural environment where Jewish women had more autonomy and responsibility than in other regions. Particularly important is understanding the concept of kitana versus gedola in Jewish law of the time. These terms distinguish between minor girls and legally competent adult women. A kitana could not make certain legal or religious decisions independently, while a gedola had full legal capacity. This has significant implications for how we interpret Mary's consent to the Annunciation. Analysis of commercial documents and marriage contracts preserved from periods close to the 1st century show that Jewish women often maintained property rights and participated in commercial transactions. This suggests a level of legal and social maturity that would be unlikely in very young adolescents. The Jewish educational system of the time is also relevant. Although girls did not attend formal schools like boys, they received extensive home education on Jewish law, religious customs, and practical skills. Mary demonstrates knowledge of the scriptures in her canticle, the Magnificat, indicating substantial religious instruction that would have taken years to acquire. Traditions about the presentation of children at the temple, although often misinterpreted, actually suggest that devout families like Mary's invested significantly in the religious education of their daughters. This would create young women with deep spiritual knowledge, but it would also indicate that they remained under family care until reaching full maturity. Customs related to marriage dowries are also relevant. Jewish families of the time invested years in preparing their daughters' dowries, which included not only material goods, but also practical skills, such as weaving, cooking, and knowledge of medicinal herbs. These preparations suggest that marriage was planned for when daughters would be fully prepared to assume adult responsibilities. The structure of Jewish family authority also indicates that important decisions such as marriage involved not only parents, but grandparents, uncles, and other older relatives. This extended family structure suggests that the young woman's well-being and preparation were carefully monitored by multiple generations. Religious festivals and rites of passage in Jewish culture marked specific transitions from childhood to adulthood. Although we do not have specific details about these rites for women in the 1st century, evidence suggests that there were clear benchmarks distinguishing girls from adult women. When we consider all these cultural elements together, a different image of Mary emerges. Instead of the passive teenager often portrayed, we see a young but mature woman, educated, economically active, and legally competent, characteristics more consistent with someone in their 20s than with a 12 or 13-year-old child. The 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are our primary sources for the life of Jesus and, consequently, Mary. But a careful analysis of these texts reveals that they contain clues about Mary's age that are rarely explored in traditional interpretations. The Gospel of Luke, which provides the most detailed account of the Annunciation, uses specific language that deserves particular attention. When the angel Gabriel addresses Mary, he uses the term kecharitomene, full of grace, or graced. Linguistic studies suggest that this term implies a state of spiritual maturity that would be unusual in a very young teenager. Particularly revealing is the Magnificat, Mary's song recorded in Luke 1:46-55. This text demonstrates a deep knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures, including specific references to the Psalms, the prophets, and the historical traditions of Israel. Such extensive biblical knowledge would suggest years of religious education and spiritual reflection. The Gospel of Matthew offers different but equally intriguing clues. Its genealogy of Jesus includes several women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. Exegetical analyses suggest that the inclusion of these women might highlight the active and mature role of women in salvation history, including Mary. John, while not narrating the birth of Jesus, provides details about Mary that are consistent with an adult, experienced woman. At the wedding at Cana, Mary takes the initiative to solve an embarrassing social problem, demonstrating social skills and authority that would be more typical of a mature woman than a newlywed teenager. Analyses of the interactions between Mary and Elizabeth in the visitation account are also revealing. Luke describes Elizabeth as an elderly woman and Mary as her younger relative, but the nature of their conversation suggests two adult women sharing life experiences, not an elderly woman comforting a frightened child. Joseph's behavior also provides important clues. Matthew reports that Joseph intended to divorce Mary secretly when he discovered her pregnancy. According to Jewish law of the time, betrothal had almost the same legal force as marriage. The fact that Joseph considered legal divorce suggests that Mary had the legal status of an adult, capable of entering into marriage contracts independently. Particularly interesting is the absence of Mary's parents in the Gospel accounts of the Annunciation and subsequent events. If Mary had been a very young girl, one would expect her parents to be present or at least mentioned during such significant events. This absence could suggest that Mary was an independent adult. Textual analyses of the terms used to describe Mary in the Gospels are also relevant. Words like gyne, woman, are used consistently, instead of terms that would specifically indicate extreme youth. These linguistic choices may not be accidental. Luke's account of Jesus' presentation at the temple describes Mary and Joseph as responsible for fulfilling all the requirements of the law. This suggests a detailed knowledge of Jewish religious practices and the ability to assume full religious responsibilities, characteristics more associated with mature adults. In John's Gospel, during the crucifixion, Jesus entrusts Mary to the care of the beloved disciple. If Mary had been a very young woman, one would expect her to be entrusted to older relatives or Joseph's family. The fact that Jesus makes this specific arrangement may suggest that Mary was an adult woman capable of forming new family relationships. Analyses of the prophecies fulfilled through Mary also suggest maturity. Mary's role as the new Eve, or as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, would imply significant spiritual responsibilities that would be more appropriate for a fully developed adult woman. When we examine the Gospels through this analytical lens, we realize that they do not contradict the possibility of an older Mary. Indeed, many details make more sense if interpreted as describing a young but mature woman rather than an inexperienced teenager. The formation of the official narrative about Mary did not happen in a vacuum. It was shaped by specific political, theological, and cultural considerations during the early centuries of Christianity. Understanding these influences is crucial to grasping how certain interpretations became irrefutable dogma. During the early ecumenical councils, particularly the Councils of Nicaea, 325 AD, and Ephesus, 431 AD, questions about the nature of Mary were intensely debated. These discussions were not purely theological. They had significant political implications for the unity of the Roman Empire and ecclesiastical control over Christian populations. The Council of Ephesus was particularly influential in establishing Mary as Theotokos, Mother of God. This decision was both theological and political, unifying various Christian traditions under a specific interpretation. The image of the pure young virgin served these unifying goals better than a more complex narrative about an adult woman. Studies of 4th and 5th century Roman imperial politics reveal that emperors like Constantine and his successors had a specific interest in promoting versions of Christianity that were palatable to the empire's populations. A young and obedient Mary resonated with Roman ideals of female virtue and social order. The influence of Eastern Marian traditions versus Western ones also shaped the official narrative. Different regions of the Christian Empire had varied local traditions about Mary. The process of unifying these traditions often involved suppressing versions that did not conform to the emerging official narrative. Documents preserved in the Vatican archives, some of which have only recently become accessible to researchers, show that discussions about Mary's age and status continued for centuries. Certain papal letters and conciliar decrees indicate that knowledge of alternative traditions existed, but conscious decisions were made not to emphasize them. The development of the Marian cult during the Middle Ages also retroactively influenced interpretations of Mary's life. Saints like Bernard of Clairvaux and theologians like Thomas Aquinas promoted specific views of Mary's virginity and purity that required a narrative of extreme youth to be convincing. Particularly relevant is the role of monastic orders in preserving and transmitting texts about Mary. Monasteries often possessed manuscripts with alternative versions of the Marian story, but chose to copy and disseminate only versions that conformed to official doctrine. Papal politics during the medieval period also played a crucial role. Popes like Innocent III and Gregory VII used specific Marian devotions to consolidate papal authority over local bishops. The narrative of the young, obedient virgin served as a model for obedience to ecclesiastical authority. Liturgical reforms over the centuries systematically removed or modified prayers and hymns that might suggest alternative interpretations of Mary. These changes were not accidental. They followed specific directives to conform local practices to central doctrine. The role of the Inquisition in suppressing alternative texts and traditions also cannot be ignored. Inquisitorial documents show that communities preserving non-conforming Marian traditions sometimes faced investigations and pressure to alter their practices. During the Counter-Reformation, especially after the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, there were systematic efforts to standardize all narratives about Mary. This included not only official doctrines but also artistic representations, liturgical traditions, and even local oral traditions. The influence of missionary considerations also shaped the official narrative. As Christianity spread to cultures with different marriage practices, missionaries often emphasized aspects of Mary's story that resonated with local values regarding female purity and youth. Studies of correspondence between different episcopal sees during the early centuries reveal that bishops sometimes disagreed on details of Mary's story, but political pressures to maintain unity often led to suppressing these discussions. The reality is that the official narrative about Mary has been shaped by much more than purely theological considerations. Political factors, needs for ecclesiastical unity, imperial pressures, and missionary goals have all contributed to establishing and maintaining a specific version of the story that may not fully reflect the historical reality of the first century. In recent decades, academics from respected universities worldwide have applied modern scientific methodologies to the study of the historical figure of Mary. These studies, published in accredited academic journals, are revealing a substantially different picture from the traditional narrative. Anthropological research on ancient Mediterranean cultures has provided valuable insights into marriage patterns in the ancient world. Comparative studies suggest that societies with family structures similar to those in first-century Palestine often delayed actual marriage until women reached full physical and social maturity. Demographic analyses based on archaeological data have revolutionized our understanding of life expectancy and family patterns in the ancient world. These studies suggest that Jewish communities of the era invested significantly in the education and preparation of their daughters before marriage, which would indicate higher marital ages than traditionally assumed. Computational linguistic studies have analyzed thousands of ancient texts to better understand how terms related to age and social status were used in Koine Greek and first-century Aramaic. These studies reveal linguistic nuances that may have been lost in later translations. Research in social history has reconstructed with increasing precision what Jewish family structures were like in Roman Palestine. These studies indicate that artisan families like Joseph's often operated as complex economic units, where women played significant commercial roles, requiring years of training and experience. Paleographic analyses using advanced digital technology have allowed for more precise readings of damaged ancient manuscripts. Some of these new readings have revealed textual variations that suggest alternative interpretations of Mary's descriptions in early texts. Interdisciplinary studies combining archaeology, anthropology, and social history have created more sophisticated models of daily life in first-century Galilee. These models suggest that women like Mary would have had responsibilities and knowledge that would be more consistent with a mature adult age. Research into oral traditions in isolated Eastern Christian communities has uncovered narratives about Mary that have been preserved independently of the Western Roman tradition. Some of these traditions suggest different ages than those commonly accepted in the West. Comparative studies of early Marian iconography versus later iconography have revealed an interesting evolution in the visual representation of Mary. The oldest representations often show a dignified adult woman, while later representations progressively emphasize extreme youth. Statistical analyses of marriage records preserved from Jewish communities of the Roman period have provided concrete data on age patterns in marriage. This data suggests that although engagements might be arranged early, actual marriages often occurred when women were between 18 and 25 years old. Research in the history of ancient medicine has revealed surprising knowledge about reproductive health in the ancient world. Studies suggest that Jewish communities had specific practices relating to the ideal age for pregnancy and childbirth, based on empirical observations about maternal and child health. Sociological analyses of female roles in ancient patriarchal societies have shown that women often gained significant status and autonomy through motherhood, but this generally occurred after they demonstrated social maturity and domestic competence. Specific archaeological studies of Nazareth have revealed that the city was larger and more cosmopolitan than traditionally assumed. This discovery has implications for understanding the social environment in which Mary grew up and the cultural influences that may have affected her education and development. Research in the history of women in the ancient world has highlighted examples of women who played significant religious roles, generally after reaching recognized social maturity. These studies provide a context for understanding how Mary could have assumed her unique role in Christian history. Before we continue to explore these fascinating discoveries, tell me, where are you watching this video from? Are you at home, at work, during a study break? It's interesting how these historical revelations can reach us anywhere and at any time, changing our perspective on truths that seemed absolute. Leave in the comments where you are following these discoveries. Ancient DNA analysis, though limited, has provided insights into the populations of the region during the relevant period. These studies, combined with anthropological analyses, are helping to reconstruct with greater precision the physical and social characteristics of the people who lived in first-century Palestine. Interdisciplinary studies combining theology, history, and archaeology have produced more nuanced interpretations of the gospel texts. These studies often reveal layers of meaning that may have been obscured by centuries of traditional interpretation. What all these modern academic studies have in common is that they apply scientific rigor to questions that were previously only addressed through tradition and theological interpretation. And their collective results paint a very different picture from what we have traditionally assumed about Mary and her historical context. The revelations about Mary's possible true age have profound theological implications that go far beyond mere historical curiosity. These discoveries challenge certain doctrinal interpretations while potentially enhancing other aspects of the Christian faith. One of the most significant implications relates to the concept of divine consent. If Mary was a mature adult woman rather than a teenager, her yes to God's will takes on different dimensions. It would be the informed consent of a fully developed person, capable of fully understanding the implications of her decision. Theological traditions that emphasize Mary's passive obedience might need to be re-examined in light of evidence that she was an active and capable adult woman. This does not diminish her virtue, but it might actually enhance the magnitude of her conscious choice to cooperate with the divine plan. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, while not directly affected by Mary's age during the Annunciation, acquires different contexts when we consider a more mature Mary. Some theologians suggest that a preservation from original sin throughout more years of earthly life could demonstrate God's special grace even more clearly. Interpretations of Mary's perpetual virginity can also be influenced by these discoveries. If Mary was older when she conceived Jesus, discussions about her subsequent virginity take on different dimensions, particularly considering Jewish marital practices of the time. Mary's role as a role model for Christian women can be enriched if she was a mature adult rather than a teenager. This would provide an example of Christian femininity that would be more relevant for adult women facing complex life decisions. Eastern Mariological traditions versus Western ones have approached Mary's age in different ways over the centuries. Eastern Orthodox churches have often preserved traditions that suggest a more mature Mary, which might indicate that these modern discoveries are actually rediscovering ancient traditions. The theology of divine motherhood can be deepened if we consider Mary as a woman fully prepared for motherhood rather than a child forced into adult circumstances. This could enhance divine providence in preparing Mary for her unique role. Interpretations of the Holy Family can also be enriched. If both Mary and Joseph were mature adults, their partnership in raising Jesus takes on dimensions of mature cooperation rather than simply following divine directions without full understanding. Discussions about free will versus predestination can be informed by a more mature understanding of Mary. An adult woman making conscious decisions provides a clearer example of free human cooperation with divine grace. Marian spirituality can be enriched if we consider that Mary spent years consciously preparing for her role, rather than being surprised by it in adolescence. This would suggest a life of deliberate spiritual growth that others can emulate. Traditions about Mary's religious education gain credibility if she had more years to acquire the deep biblical knowledge demonstrated in the Magnificat. This could inspire a renewed emphasis on female religious education. Interpretations of Mary's suffering, particularly during the Passion, can be deepened if we consider that she experienced this suffering as a mature woman who consciously chose to accompany her son through his mission. Mary's role in the early church, although sparsely documented in the Gospels, may make more sense if she was a mature and respected woman rather than a dependent young widow. This might explain her apparent influence in the early years of the Christian community. These theological implications do not destroy Christian faith, they can actually enrich it. A more mature Mary is no less holy, but she can be more inspiring for believers facing complex adult decisions on how to respond to the divine call in their lives. Historical truth and theological truth do not have to be in conflict. Indeed, a more precise understanding of Mary's historical reality can deepen our appreciation for the magnitude of her role in salvation history. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided further support for a revisited understanding of Mary's age. This evidence, although indirect, creates a contextual framework that makes a more mature Mary not only plausible, but probable. Excavations in Jewish cemeteries of the Roman era have revealed interesting patterns about the age of marriage and motherhood. Analysis of female skeletons shows that first pregnancy often occurred between 20 and 25 years old, not in early adolescence as traditionally assumed. Discoveries of weaving-related objects in residential sites in Galilee suggest that young women spent years learning complex textile skills before marriage. These findings indicate a prolonged period of domestic preparation that would be more consistent with marriages at a more mature age. Analysis of family dwelling remains shows structures designed for mature nuclear families rather than for newlywed teenagers. These discoveries suggest that new couples waited until they had sufficient resources and maturity before establishing independent homes. Discoveries of medical instruments and evidence of obstetric practices in domestic contexts indicate that women often possessed specialized medical knowledge. Such knowledge required years of learning and experience, suggesting that family health responsibilities were undertaken by mature women. Excavations at Sepphoris, a city near Nazareth, have revealed evidence of significant commercial activity involving women. Findings include personal seals, balance weights, and other commercial tools associated with female names, indicating active economic participation that required maturity. Analysis of graffiti and inscriptions in homes of the era shows that women were often identified by their personal achievements rather than only by family relationships. This suggests a social recognition of individual competencies that usually developed with age. Discoveries of amulets and personal religious objects in female domestic contexts indicate sophisticated devotional practices. These findings suggest a developed spiritual life that would be more characteristic of women with substantial religious experience. Archaeological evidence on funerary practices shows that women who died young were often buried with different objects than those who died after forming a family. This differentiation suggests a clear social recognition between girls and adult women. Discoveries of pottery workshops and other artisanal production sites show evidence of specialized female labor. These skills required years of training, suggesting that women contributed economically to families through skills developed over time. Analysis of pollen and other organic remains in habitation sites reveals evidence of complex domestic gardens. The knowledge required to maintain these gardens, including medicinal plants, suggests that women possessed substantial botanical and medicinal knowledge. Excavations in synagogues of the era have revealed evidence of female participation in communal religious activities. Findings include designated areas for women and objects that suggest active involvement in synagogue life, which would indicate a social recognition of religious maturity. Discoveries of games and toys in archaeological contexts show a clear distinction between objects associated with children and personal objects of adults. This material differentiation suggests that ancient societies recognized distinct stages of development that included a young adult woman phase before motherhood. Evidence of aqueduct systems and domestic infrastructure shows that creating new homes required considerable resources and planning. This suggests that couples waited until they had sufficient economic and social capacity before marrying, which would favor more mature ages. Analysis of food remains and cooking utensils reveals complex culinary practices in homes of the era. The knowledge required for these practices, including food preservation and nutrition, suggests that women assumed domestic responsibilities only after years of preparation. These archaeological evidences, considered collectively, paint a picture of a society where young women spent years preparing to assume full adult responsibilities. This context makes it much more plausible that Mary was a mature woman when she took on her unique role in Christian history. After examining archaeological evidence, ancient manuscripts, the Jewish cultural context, analysis of the Gospels, ecclesiastical political influences, and modern academic studies, one conclusion emerges. Mary most likely was between 18 and 25 years old when she conceived Jesus, not the traditionally assumed 12 to 16 years old. This conclusion is based on multiple converging lines of evidence. First-century Jewish marital customs, as revealed by archaeology and preserved documents, indicate that women often married only after reaching full physical and social maturity. The biblical knowledge demonstrated by Mary in the Magnificat suggests years of religious education and spiritual reflection. This level of theological understanding would be unusual in a teenager, but appropriate for a young woman who has spent years studying the scriptures and the traditions of her people. The specific language used in the Gospels to describe Mary is consistent with an adult woman rather than a child. Terms like kecharitomini, full of grace, and the responsibilities she assumes suggest spiritual and social maturity. Archaeological evidence on family structures, economic practices, and women's roles in first-century Galilee all point to a society where women assumed full adult responsibilities only after years of careful preparation. The absence of mention of Mary's parents during crucial events like the Annunciation and the birth of Jesus may indicate that she was an independent adult, capable of making legal and social decisions autonomously. Joseph's behavior, who planned to divorce Mary secretly, makes more sense if she was an adult with independent legal status rather than a child under direct parental authority. But why has this information been obscured or misinterpreted over the centuries? The reasons are complex and multifaceted. First, the image of the young, innocent virgin served specific theological purposes, emphasizing purity, obedience, and humility in ways that resonated with ancient and medieval audiences. Second, political influences during the development of institutional Christianity favored interpretations that promoted doctrinal unity rather than historical complexity. A simple and inspiring narrative was more useful for catechesis and evangelization than nuanced historical details. Third, artistic and literary traditions perpetuated certain visual images that became so iconic that they were treated as historical facts. Renaissance paintings of an adolescent Mary influenced theological interpretations as much as the reverse. Fourth, cultural differences between the ancient Mediterranean world and later cultures led to misunderstandings about marital practices and social structures. What was normal in the first century was filtered through later cultural lenses that assumed different patterns. This revelation does not diminish Mary or her role in Christian history. On the contrary, it can enhance it. An adult Mary who consciously chose to cooperate with the divine plan demonstrates mature faith and a deliberate decision rather than simply following directions without full understanding of the implications. A 20-year-old woman in first-century Jewish culture would have been considered young but fully mature. She would have spent years learning domestic skills, studying religious traditions, and developing the wisdom necessary to assume full family responsibilities. This more mature Mary also provides a more relevant model for contemporary Christian women. Instead of an obedient child, she represents an adult who made conscious choices about how to respond to the divine call in her life. The truth about Mary's age also has implications for understanding the Holy Family. Joseph and Mary as mature adult partners present a model of Christian marriage based on mutual cooperation and shared decisions, rather than simply the patriarchal protection of a child wife. Most importantly, this revelation demonstrates that historical truth and spiritual truth can harmoniously coexist. A more precise understanding of the historical context of the Incarnation can actually deepen our appreciation for the mystery of cooperation between the divine and the human. Mary's true age when she conceived Jesus does not change the central fact that God chose to work through a human woman to enter history. But understanding who this woman truly was, a mature, educated, and capable adult, can enrich our understanding of how God works through real people in specific historical circumstances. We have reached the end of a fascinating journey through historical evidence, archaeological discoveries, and academic analyses that have revealed an image of Mary substantially different from the traditional narrative. These revelations are not intended to diminish Christian faith, but rather to enrich it through a more precise understanding of historical reality. The discovery that Mary likely was between 18 and 25 years old when she conceived Jesus has profound implications for how we understand not only the mother of Jesus, but the entire narrative of the Incarnation. A mature, educated, and capable Mary presents an even more powerful example of conscious human cooperation with the divine plan. These revelations also demonstrate the importance of applying academic rigor even to the most sacred aspects of human history. Historical truth and spiritual truth are not enemies. They can collaborate to provide a deeper and richer understanding of the events that shaped our civilization. The fact that certain interpretations became tradition does not necessarily mean they are historically accurate. Traditions develop for complex reasons that include theological needs, political considerations, cultural influences, and limitations of available historical knowledge in specific eras. Modern science, including archaeology, textual analysis, linguistic studies, and historical research, provides us with tools to examine the past with unprecedented precision. When we apply these tools respectfully to Christian narratives, we often discover layers of richness and complexity that were unknown to previous generations. An adult and mature Mary is no less inspiring than a teenager. In fact, she might be more inspiring. She represents a woman who spent years spiritually, intellectually, and emotionally preparing to assume extraordinary responsibilities. Her positive response to the divine call demonstrates a mature faith based on a real understanding, not just thoughtless obedience. This discovery also has contemporary relevance. In an era when the role of women in society is constantly being re-evaluated, a mature and capable Mary provides a biblical model of femininity that combines spiritual strength with practical competence, profound faith with active intelligence. For believers, these revelations can deepen Marian devotion by presenting an even more admirable woman, someone who consciously chose to cooperate with God after years of spiritual preparation and personal growth. For historians, they demonstrate the importance of continuing to investigate even the most established narratives. The truth about Mary's age also illustrates how historical knowledge evolves. What one generation accepts as established fact, subsequent generations may discover to be an interpretation based on limited information. This does not invalidate the faith of previous generations, but invites us to remain open to new discoveries. Most importantly, this journey through the evidence demonstrates that honest questions about Christian history do not threaten faith, they can strengthen it. A faith based on accurate historical understanding is more robust than one based on unchallenged traditions. The implications of these discoveries extend beyond academic curiosity. They invite us to reconsider how we interpret ancient texts, how traditions develop, and how we can integrate modern historical knowledge with spiritual faith. This has not been an attempt to demystify Mary or diminish her importance. On the contrary, it has been an effort to understand her more completely as the extraordinary woman she truly was. Not a passive child, but a conscious adult who made choices that changed the course of human history. If you have been struck by these revelations and want to continue exploring historical truths that challenge traditional narratives, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. And don't miss the next video that will appear on your screen. We will continue to investigate historical mysteries that can change your perspective on events that shaped our civilization. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.